You and I, in our time, we ask the question why. We ask that question when we do not know what is happening. We ask the question why when things do not make sense. We ask the question why when we want to know the purpose, but we do not know the purpose. We ask the question why when we expect God to do something and we have a picture of what it should look like, but it doesn't look like that, and we ask why. This morning, as we go through life, we can relate to Habakkuk's cries. And the big question is this: in the midst of it all, and you may be asking this question right now, in the midst of it all, can we trust God as we wrestle with our whys? All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to read the passage, we're going to break it down, and in the end, we're going to try to answer the question, how does all of this apply to my life with where I am today? Starting with Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12. This is Habakkuk praying to God, giving his response to God. All right, verse 12 says this: "Are you not from eternity, Lord my God?" Okay, this is Habakkuk crying out to God. And what we see here is Habakkuk recognizing who God is. That God is great. He's eternal. He's all powerful. And so he's recognizing, when he says that you are from eternity, he is recognizing that God has not been created, that there's no one more powerful than God. And so he's crying out to the character and the nature of God. And he continues in verse 12 when he says, "My Holy One." My Holy One. Okay, so when we hear the word holy, the Hebrew word for that is kadosh. And kadosh means, in Hebrew, means to be made separate from, or you're separated from something else. All right, so when we recognize the holiness of God, he is so great, he's so powerful, he is so pure that compared to who we are, he's separate from us, he is holy. And so here Habakkuk is crying out and recognizing the holiness of God, that God is above all, he's perfect, and he's separate from us. He says, "My Holy One, you will not die." In other words, God, you created, you are eternal, right? Going back to the nature of God. And then he continues, he said, "Lord, you appointed them." He's referring to the Babylonians, to the Babylonian Empire. "You appointed them to execute judgment, my rock." Okay, so he's saying, God, I recognize your character, but at the same time in your character, you are using the Babylonians or the Chaldeans to overtake us, to bring judgment on us. And then he calls God my rock. He's saying, God, you are my foundation. I trust you, I believe in you, and you're also my refuge. You're my rock. But God, as I place my faith in you, as I recognize your character, what you are doing in this time is not making sense. And then he goes on to say, you destined them to punishment, to punish us, right? So destined them. Once again, talking about the Babylonian Empire. And he's saying that it is, he's recognizing that the Babylonians are going to be the one to bring justice to the southern kingdom of Judah, right? To God's people living in the southern part of Israel during this time. The Babylonians will not destroy, but God will use them to bring justice, to purify his people, right? Those living in the southern kingdom of Judah, so that they would turn to God. And this took place somewhere between 620 to 600 BC, right? If we look in history, we can see that about 612 BC, there was the Battle of Nineveh, where the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians. And at 605 BC, we see how the Babylonians defeated the Egyptians. And the Egyptians thought, well, if we could just get a little help from the Assyrians, and maybe we could beat the Babylonians. They could not. So it was about this time in world history that the Babylonian Empire asserted power throughout the world. And so it was during this time that God, as he spoke into Habakkuk, he was saying that it is this empire, the Babylonians, I will use them to bring judgment on you, on my people. In verse 13, right, Habakkuk keeps praying. He says, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. He's talking to God. Okay, he's saying your eyes are too pure. Now, some people may read that. They'll say, well, does that mean that whenever there's evil, God just can't see it? No, that's not the context. God sees evil. God knows evil. God is sovereign. What this means is that God is holy. And the holiness of his character is far superior and more powerful than evil. And so God does not have to put up with evil. He is not evil. And so there's something about evil that churns the heart and the spirit of God. But it doesn't mean that God can't look at evil. In fact, when we look at God and who he is, we know that God is sovereign. And we even read throughout Scripture how through history and people and nations, right, where it seemed as though evil was winning. God saw all of that. But in the sovereignty of God, God who is sovereign uses everything for his glory. Every pain, every suffering, every defeat for his glory. And so here, God will once again use this for his glory, right? But Habakkuk's not understanding, and he's crying out to God. He says, your eyes are too pure to look on evil, and you cannot tolerate wrongdoing. So why do you tolerate those who are treacherous? Why are you silent while one who is wicked swallows up one who is more righteous than himself? This is where the sovereignty of God and his holiness is not making sense, right? Because if Habakkuk had his way, there would be a different way that this would have been handled. Maybe it could have been where there were religious leaders who were leading people astray. And so maybe in his mind he could have said, hey, why don't you just destroy them and just really care for us? There are a lot of innocent people. They may not fully believe or understand you, God, but if we had the right leaders in place, maybe they would turn to you. So if you take care of these people, then maybe, just maybe, this whole southern kingdom of Judah would turn to you. Or maybe Habakkuk would have told God, right, if he had his way, hey, God, why don't you destroy the Babylonians? So that when you destroy the Babylonians, we can give testimony and say that you did it, and maybe the religious and the powerful people would say, wow, that's God. I mean, there are all kinds of thoughts maybe that went on in Habakkuk's mind and how this should have been handled, but it didn't happen that way. And so here's the sovereignty of God, the holiness of God, right? So we see Habakkuk, he's probably wrestling with that. He's saying, how can that happen? How can you allow this to happen? You appear to be silent at this time while evil is increasing. Some of you are right there right now. In your life, and this happens in our lives, where it seems as though maybe evil is increasing, circumstances are turning bad, and we're crying out to God and we're saying, God, can you do something? And God appears silent. And then we cry out to God like Habakkuk did last week. How long? How long is this going to happen? And we cry out to God like he's doing this morning. Why? God, why is this happening. That may be your heart cry this morning. Verse 14 says, you have made mankind like the fish of the sea, like marine creatures that have no ruler. Okay, so he's giving us a visual picture of how he sees the people in the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay, 600 years before Jesus was born, he describes the people of Judah like fish of the sea, like marine creatures that have no ruler. So here's a visual picture. In the open sea, fish swim. Fish are vulnerable. Fish can be eaten by other fish. Fish can swim into dragnets by fishermen. Fish can see what appears to be food, but pulled up by a hook and caught and become someone's dinner that night, right? So there's a sense of vulnerability. See, Habakkuk is saying in the same way, God, as the Babylonians are coming in, we feel unprotected. We feel vulnerable. Who we are as a people, we do not even compare. Militarily, we don't compare with the Babylonians. Financially, we do not compare with the Babylonians. They are greater than us. We feel vulnerable. Verse 15, the Chaldeans pull them all up with a hook. Okay, so during this time, as a Babylonian empire, right, the Chaldeans, Babylonian empire, synonymous. As a Babylonian empire, as it was making its way throughout the world, they were conquering nations and people groups like a fisherman would pull up fish from a water, right, with the hook. They would hook them. And so he's giving that visual picture, right? So, and then he goes, catch them in their dragnet and gather them in their fishing net. Right, so like fishermen in sea, the Babylonians are conquering nations. That is why they are glad and rejoice. Okay, the Babylonians, the Babylonian Empire, they are seeing what they are doing. They are celebrating. They're glad. They are rejoicing. You see, as they conquered nations, as they increased power, as they began to experience more and more success, as they became the most powerful empire in the world, they had every reason to celebrate. Life on the outside appeared to be going good for them. They're becoming more powerful and richer, and so they were rejoicing. In fact, in verse 16, it says this, that is why they sacrificed to their drag net. Okay, so the idea of drag net, you know, when you're fishing, you have this big net and you just let that thing drag, and whatever gets caught in there, fish, that is your catch. And so they are worshiping. Here's what they're worshiping. They are worshiping their power. They are worshiping what gives them power. They are worshiping whatever gives them the opportunity to expand their territory. They're worshiping that. They're giving their lives to that. Right? That's somewhat in their discussions. It's all about, hey, how do we give ourselves to this power? How do we give ourselves to the strategy? How do we give ourselves to this momentum so that we can conquer more nations? They have given their lives to that. Verse 16 goes on to say, and burn incense in their fishing net, and burn incense to their fishing net. Okay, so this is, when it's saying, when they're talking about burning incense to their fishing net, this, Habakkuk is saying they are worshiping what is making them great. So this is what made them great. They're going to continue to give their lives to that, and they're going to continue to worship that. Okay, so Habakkuk is crying out to God. He's saying, these are bad people. They are evil, and they don't even worship you. So why in the world are you using them? And then it goes on to say, for by these things, their portion is rich and their food plentiful. And then in verse 17, Habakkuk says this, will they therefore empty their net and continually slaughter nations without mercy? Right? So Habakkuk, he's crying out. He's saying, God, you're a good God. And here's an evil nation. Why are you allowing this to happen? It goes back to the cry of Habakkuk in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 2, when Habakkuk cried out, how long? And as he cried out, how long, the question of how long were these? How long will this continue? How long will evil triumph over good? How long will this go on? And then we move into Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. Habakkuk continues with his response to God, his prayer to God. He says, I will stand at my guard post and station myself on the lookout tower. I will watch to see what he will say to me and what I should reply about my complaint. Okay, so here's what's going on. In verses 12 through 17, Nehemiah, he's telling God what God already knew, but he's pouring out to God, right? He's saying, hey, God, you are a holy God, and I recognize that. Babylon, they're bad. The Babylonians, they're evil, but yet it seems as though they are winning. And he's saying, God, hear my cry. Hear my heart. But I love Habakkuk's response in verse 1. Let me read it again. He said, I will stand at my guard post. So when we go through difficult times, hardship, when we do not understand the whys, we see Habakkuk's example that can be an example to all of us, right? The idea of standing at his guard post and station myself on the lookout tower. So he is like a soldier, right? So his heart posture to God was like a soldier who is looking out for the enemy, looking for possible attacks. He is ready. And so in the same way, Habakkuk is saying, God, I am ready for you. I am ready to hear from you. God, my heart yearns for you, and I'm going to be as alert as I can be. And then Habakkuk goes on in verse 1, he says, I will watch to see what he will say to me. Right? So Habakkuk is saying, I will be faithful, and I will be ready to hear from you, God. And then Habakkuk finishes up verse 1 by saying, and what I should reply about my complaint. He's saying, I'm ready to hear, God, but not only ready to hear, but I'm ready to respond. I'm ready to obey in the way that you have spoken. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 through 5, God responds to Habakkuk. It says this in verse 2, the Lord answered me, write down this vision. Okay? So, here's Habakkuk. He's pouring out his heart. God speaks. Habakkuk is ready to respond to God. God says, write down this vision. What is the vision? Right? What is the vision? Well, the vision is that Babylon will be God's instrument of judgment on the people of the southern kingdom of Judah. However, Babylon will fall, and that there will be restoration. There's going to be a time of restoration. But he says, write down this vision clearly, inscribe it on tablets so one may easily read it. Okay, so he's saying, hey, make it visible, make it clear. These are words that are they're gonna go through history. People are gonna read this. This is about the nature of God. This is about all of who God is. People are gonna know that I am true. People are gonna know that I'm real because of these words, right? So God said, write this down. It's gonna happen. And when it does happen, people are gonna look back and say, wow, that's what God said, Right? Basically, that is what God is telling Habakkuk to do. Verse 3, for the vision is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end and will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it, since I will certainly come and not be late. Okay, so verse 3, talking about this vision. And so this vision is not yet for the appointed time. In other words, God is saying, Habakkuk, this vision will not happen immediately, right? He's saying it's not going to happen right now. This is also not going to happen on Habakkuk's time, but this is all going to happen on God's time. And then he goes on to say that I testify about the end and it will not lie. So he's saying that this vision is true. All right, so this is really important. Any word that comes from God, when God says that something's going to happen, it always happens. There's nothing that God says that will happen that does not happen. On the flip side, if God says that something's not going to happen, okay, it's not going to happen. Because God is true. These words came from God. And then he finishes up verse 3 by saying, since it will certainly come and not be late, right? He's saying that this is all going to happen. Verse 4, look, his ego is inflated, right? He's talking about the Babylonian Empire and those who are in leadership of the Babylonian Empire. He, okay, talking about the Babylonian Empire and the leaders, is without integrity. Okay, so God recognizes that. God is saying they are not right with God, but in their pride, in their desire for more, they have no place for faith in God. Verse 4, but the righteous one will live by his faith. So when there's pride in our lives, when we depend on ourselves, here's what happens. We have no room for God. Even in our own lives, when we try to figure things out on our own, when we depend on our abilities, on our minds, on our talents, and who we are, we have no place for God. And sometimes God brings us to a place of brokenness where we recognize that our talents and our past accomplishments or our status or relationships, all of that can't help us anymore, and the only one who can is God. And that is a good place to be, and some of you have testimonies of that in your lives, where God just broke you down. Right? You have all the talent, all the brains, all the status, all the connections, but somehow things were just not working out. And God broke you down to lead you to recognize, and me to recognize, that we need God. And then, right, says, look, his ego is inflated, he is without integrity, right? He's not right with God, no place for faith, but the righteous one will live by faith. The righteous one will depend on God, will admit that we cannot do this life on our own. That there's something that goes beyond ourselves. That eternity does not happen on our own abilities. Our abilities to walk through what God calls us to walk through does not happen on our own, but we must live by his faith, faith that comes through God, the faith that God gives us and the faith that we lean on. And when we live by his faith, it's a result of the righteousness that comes from God. We can't do this on our own. And then in verse 5 it says this, moreover, wine betrays. Okay, so the visual picture for that, this is more symbolic, or more making reference to the fact that wine deceives. Wine gives people false confidence. Wine is very destructive. Right? We think about just the false perception that we have. Right? When you're drunk, it's deceptive. There's false confidence. It's destructive. Right? It says wine betrays, an arrogant man is never at rest. Okay, so because we are deceived and because we have this false confidence, we do not see the destructive nature of what we are doing. But here's the thing about deception. we are often deceived into thinking that we can accomplish something, even if we're headed in the wrong direction. We can be deceived thinking that we can accomplish something as we head in the wrong direction. We're deceived into thinking that we can do it on our own strength and our own power. And as we are heading in the wrong direction, depending on our own strength and power, that deception leads us to death. Outside of Jesus, that's death. For some, outside of Jesus, if you don't have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, it leads you to eternal death, eternal separation from God. In many ways in our lives, if that is not of the Lord, if it is not God, we can be deceived into thinking that that's the right way and that we depend on our abilities, our judgment, instead of seeking God. And that becomes very, very destructive. Destructive in relationships, destructive in our futures. Right, that's what he is saying. And so Babylon, during this time, they became the model of that. Babylon was never content or satisfied. They were driven by greed. Babylon's outward expansion reflected their inner lacking of peace. Their pride kept them away from God. Is that your life? Is that my life this morning? He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, all right? So Babylon enlarges his appetite for more. Sheol, that is the symbol of death. It's a symbol of what leads to death. Pride consumes. Anytime we take our eyes off of God, pride consumes. And it says this, and like death, he is never satisfied. He gathers all the nations to himself. He collects all the peoples for himself. Talking about death, right? Talking about, so he's talking about the Babylonian Empire, all right? So we're gonna finish up this chapter next week because God is gonna continue to speak and describe the Babylonian Empire. Well, let's make some application to our lives this morning. As I said earlier last week, we applied Habakkuk's question of how long. And we talked about asking that question about what goes on in our nation, in Hawaii, and even in our personal lives. This week, we wrestle with the question of why. Why God would accomplish his purpose in the way that he does it. Why does he do it when we do not understand? And as we are asking that question this morning, for many, this has been a challenging year. Maybe your health has been a challenge. Your finances have been a challenge. There may have been tremendous loss in your life this past year. Maybe you lost a loved one. Maybe you had dreams and hopes for the future. And those dreams and hopes either died or it's becoming harder to achieve. There are broken relationships, or maybe relationships are being challenged this year. Maybe there are issues related to your job, and the list can go on and on, but as you're going through that, maybe you have cried out to God, and then you're asking God, how long? And maybe you've even adjusted your life to honoring God, but as you're doing that, it seems as though nothing's happening, and so now your next question is, why? And then as we're going through that, what's on the news, and we all know what's happening, right? It's the elephant in the room, the government shutdown. And we know that this is affecting many people, not only nationally, but maybe even in our church, in our community. We know that financially, this is going to be hard and it's causing tension. And so in the same way, we ask the question, God, how long? How long? And God, why is this happening? That may be a question that you're wrestling with this morning. This past week, and I just want to share something a little bit more personal. I have a pastor friend. His son committed suicide. This is a man who God has used in a very powerful way. He loves God. He's been serving faithfully. But his teenage son committed suicide. And here's what he wrote on his social media post this past week. He said, "There are no words for the ache and emptiness we feel over our sweet boy, Brennan. We would give anything, even our own lives, to bring him back. But we know we can't. Yet, we know the one who did. The one who gave his life so that death would not have the final word. So come, weep with us, remember with us, lament with us, and then together, let's lift our eyes to the very real hope we have in heaven." I know it's hard. They are struggling. These are real life examples. Your life is a real life example of the questions that Habakkuk cried out to God with. So as we make our application this morning, I want us to know how we face our whys. When we face our whys based on this passage, what do? I want to share 3 things. Number 1, bring your questions to God. Okay, when you face your whys, bring your questions to God. When we looked at Habakkuk chapter 1, all of chapter 1, moving into chapter 2, we see how Habakkuk asked God, "Why are you silent? How long will you allow this?" Habakkuk also asked God, "If you are holy and good, why are you letting evil continue?" He also asked, "Why are you letting a wicked nation punish us?" Sometimes as Christians we think, well, God is so big and holy, I'm not supposed to ask him any questions. And so you don't. And you stuff it in there. I want to encourage you this morning to look at Habakkuk's example and see how he cried out to God and he asked God questions. And that you ask God questions about what is happening in your life and the circumstances going on around you. You see, for many of us, the questions that we have about God are often related to unanswered prayers, right? So it's like we pray and we say, "God, why are you not answering my prayers?" And so the tension is, okay, if I ask God why he's not answering my prayers, if I stop asking him, will he answer my prayers? God already knows. Continue to ask God. Continue to seek God. We also have questions about evil and suffering. Right, God, if you're so good, why are you allowing evil and suffering to happen? We also ask God the question, we're saying, "God, do you really exist?" Right? Does God exist? And this leads into another question. God, if you do exist, do you really care? Because if you really cared, you wouldn't be allowing me to go through this. Another question that we wrestle with is this: how can I trust God if he doesn't do anything when I need him? That may be something you are going through right now. In Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5, God said, "For I'm doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear about it." You know what God is telling Habakkuk? That he's already at work. And that he's going to do something in a way that Habakkuk did not understand. But what we're going to see throughout this book is how Habakkuk had his heart fixed on God and how he was willing to respond to God, so that when he comes to the end, Habakkuk had a heart posture towards God that was transformed. And he said, "I will follow you no matter what." So then it becomes a question of heart posture, right? So what should our heart posture before God be? What should it look like as we're asking him questions? First of all, we need to believe who God says he is. We need to believe in his character. I know that for some it's going to be hard, right? It's like, how can I trust his character when he's not doing what I want? Well, that's where we just have to trust his character. Ask God for the strength to trust his character. Believe who God says he is. And then we need to ask with the right motives. You know people like this because I know people like this. They will keep asking questions and they say, hey, what about this about God? And then you answer that question, but then they take you on a tangent and they ask another question, and then you answer that question. They ask a question off a question off a question, and then you wonder, do they really want to know God? But what about you and me in our time? Do you want to know God? We need to ask with the right motive. So here's the wrong motive is to say, God, I want to disprove who you are. Because if we start with the foundation to say, God, I want to disprove who you are, you're going to ask question after question after question, and someone's going to answer. You're going to ask question off of that answer, and then they're going to come out with an answer. There's all these questions. But if you have the right motive, right? And so what we read about in Habakkuk, he said, God, I'm waiting for you. I'm going to listen for you. I'm going to obey. I'm going to respond. When God does respond, when we have the right motive, we will hear from God. Number 3, be ready to listen. Be ready to listen. Number 2, when facing your whys, we need to trust God's timing. Trust God's timing. Don't rush. Don't rush God for an answer. Here's what we need to do, and this is really hard. We need to wait. It's hard, but we need to wait. We need to wait. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, Habakkuk waits. He does not force things to happen. Waiting is hard. Waiting is hard. Right? For some, you can't wait for Thanksgiving. It's not even at the end of October yet. Some, you can't wait for Christmas. Waiting is hard. Now, when we talk about waiting, we're not talking about doing nothing. Okay, when we say wait, sometimes we think, oh, let's just go and wait. No, waiting is having anticipation in our hearts for what God is doing. As we wait, we seek God. As we wait, we know God. As we wait, we grow in our relationship with God through Jesus Christ. All right, last thing, when facing your whys, number 3, live by faith. Live by faith even when it doesn't make sense. You know, I know that if you're going through something right now, and you're hearing that, right? Live by faith even when it doesn't make sense. That can be frustrating. But I want to encourage you right now, as we all go through whatever we're going through, as we're looking out in our state, our nation, our personal lives, continue to live by faith. And we don't live by faith by just trying to make it happen for ourselves, grinning and bearing. We live by faith based on the work of Christ in us. And as we're growing in our relationship with God through Jesus Christ, we're saying, Jesus, you are my greatest priority. You are priority for me. I lay my life in your hands and I will trust you. I believe in you. I give you my life. And we live by that faith, by his faith, faith that comes through Christ and Christ alone. And as we live by faith, we trust that God is at work. We wait. We wait. We trust God even when we do not see or understand what he is doing. And I'll make you this promise, that when we do wait on God, when we wait on the Lord, when we live by faith, even when it's hard, even when we do not understand, when we do it with the right heart and motives, you will never be let down. you will get to the other side as you trust God. And you will see the goodness and the grace and the mercy and the power of God. Live by faith. All right, let's go to God in prayer. God,